The 2022 Austrian Grand Prix proving once again that this new era of ground effect cars with the 18-inch Pirelli tires is exactly what we've been asking for. Another race full of exciting overtakes, some painful retirements, and some rather surprising results. Not all of them were good, and well, not all of them were surprising. Arguably, the purpose-built circuits with some runoff areas and some room for the drivers to stretch their elbows has resulted in some spectacular shows. My name is Blake, and welcome to Break F1. After spending 10 years in Formula 1 as both a trackside and simulator performance engineer for Red Bull and Force India, I'm now making analytical and data-driven Formula 1 content just for you. Now, as for the Austrian Grand Prix, we're going to dig into the Ferrari pace from the sprint and see what was different between Max running away with the sprint race on Saturday versus Ferrari outright dominating Red Bull on Sunday. Which brings me to the next topic. It seems like something happened to the Red Bulls on Sunday that we really haven't seen too much of this year yet. Is it possible that Ferrari have found Red Bull's weakness in terms of tire pace and management? Now, the final 2 points of this are kind of related, and I appreciate all the comments on my YouTube post with the suggestions. By the way, every Sunday after a race, I do a little YouTube community post. It gives you guys a chance to help guide where I take these analysis videos, so be sure to subscribe to the channel and keep an eye out for those. Now, the last thing I actually want to dig into is what happened to the Mercedes and Haas this weekend. On one hand, it seemed like the Haas, despite not really bringing any major upgrades, has found a very reasonable form, with Mick Schumacher seeming to unlock something we've yet to see from him. On the other hand, we ended up with Hamilton and Russell bringing home the Mercedes in 3rd and 4th, but their pace this weekend was much less impressive than what we saw in both Canada and Silverstone. What's going on here? Now, it's the part you've been waiting for. It's time to break down the Austrian GP with some data. Now, if you've been paying close attention this season, I think you'll agree that Ferrari have had outright the fastest car, but they've had two main problems. The first thing is their reliability. The number of DNFs they've had this season has resulted in Verstappen leading the Red Bulls to the top of the Drivers' and Constructors' Championship. To some degree, this weekend was another example of that. Carlos Sainz' engine spontaneously ventilating itself down to turn 4 as he was chasing Max Verstappen on what should have been an easy overtake for P2. Now, the second thing is what on the outside looks like poor strategy calls, which end up resulting in less than optimal results for the team. Now, Ferrari boss Mattia Binotto has said it's too early for team orders, but there appear to be several instances where a clear lack of direction have resulted in reasonable loss of points. In the past few events, we've seen several instances with the Ferraris losing time fighting each other, with arguably the faster driver being stuck behind, resulting in a less than optimal finish for the team. The sprint race on Saturday was another great example of this, so let's talk about this and why it's important for the race on Sunday. Now, I'm going to refer to this sort of graphic throughout the presentation as the race trace. In short, this demonstrates the gap between drivers on any given lap of the race, and we can use it to visualize the difference in drivers' pace relative to each other. Now, the image here is Saturday's sprint race. Max Verstappen appeared to easily stay in front of the Ferraris to secure those 8 points from the sprint race. You can see here that Max easily held the gap to Leclerc throughout the entire race. During the first 6 laps of the race, Leclerc defending quite heavily to Sainz, allowing Verstappen to run off into the distance. Now, my guess is that both Leclerc and Sainz used up a lot of their tires fighting each other. Judging from this, Charles didn't really have much pace left, and Max could easily match his lap times to secure the sprint race win. Sainz's lap times also take quite a reasonable hit, and he falls a bit behind Leclerc, finishing 3rd, easily ahead of Hamilton. But come Sunday for the actual Grand Prix, this has all changed completely. So let's dig into it. Now, there's a few things to consider here. The fuel load at the start of the actual Grand Prix is probably over 100 kilos, whereas the sprint race fuel load is probably a third of that, so that's one factor. Now, at the start of the race, Leclerc locks onto Verstappen and does not let them go as they pull a gap to Sainz. As soon as Leclerc gets through on Verstappen on lap 12, Max appears to hit a cliff in terms of his tire performance. He stops for a new set of hards, and it looks like Max is now on a 2-stop from here. There's no way he's doing 56 plus laps on a hard after that first stint. At this point, both Sainz and Leclerc are also maintained reasonable pace for 25 laps on a medium tire, compared to Max only lasting about 12 laps at that same pace. Now, I'd argue, should Leclerc have been defending heavily to Sainz, I think we probably would have seen a repeat of the sprint race, but we saw something entirely different. As it's the first time in a few events that we've seen Leclerc actually racing Verstappen, did they push Red Bull into a corner and reveal one of their weaknesses, or was it something else? Let's look a bit more at the race, but I've got another idea that might explain Red Bull's lack of race performance, but I'll come back to this one in a second. Now, there's one small problem with relying on the race traces alone, and I'll explain. Now, if you see this here, you might think that Verstappen has suffered an insane tire degradation on his second stint, but there's something else going on. At the first glance, I assume Max's tires hit a cliff, but it's a bit less sinister than that. The way the data is prepared will skew this based on the relative pace of each driver. As a sanity check, let's compare this point of Verstappen to this point on Leclerc, and actually look at the different pace between the two cars. Now, these are the fuel corrected lap times for the drivers on their second stint. If anybody's wondering what fuel corrected means, this is simply a rough calculation where I guess how much fuel the car is burning per lap and then determine the fuel load and how much lap time is lost from that amount of fuel. When comparing the pace across stints and compounds in a race, this is pretty common practice in the industry. Now, my main takeaway is that the degradation on the Red Bull on the second stint of hard tires was higher, but not absurd. I could also argue that since the Ferrari had a reasonable margin after the Red Bull had to stop early on their first stint, they were also just managing their pace later in the stint. They had a good gap to Verstappen, so really all they had to do was manage their pace to match him, really. Now, I would also argue that as a precaution, after Red Bull had huge degradation on their first medium, they appear to have eased this hard tire set in quite easily, with Max able to put in some very reasonable lap times in the middle of the stint. But they do appear to drop off a little bit more than the Ferraris after 15 or 16 laps on the hard. So there might be a further explanation as to why Red Bull's struggling with their tire management here. Now, if we look back at the first stint on mediums, you can see that Max well and truly hit a wall here. And at the beginning of the stint, he was actually holding up the Ferraris. They probably had more pace in hand. After Max pits here, the Ferrari can easily hold on until they start to run in some deg 20 laps into the stint, whereas Max hit this wall at only 10 laps into his medium tire. Now let's finish up the Red Bull and Ferrari race for the podium. Max is starting to see some drop off on his second set of hard tires as the Ferraris box for new hards and drop just behind him. Leclerc makes easy work overtaking Verstappen, and Sainz is now approaching here. Unfortunately, the Ferrari of Sainz experiences some spontaneous engine ventilation. Okay, the thing absolutely its guts out the tailpipe and blows the side pod to pieces from the manifold exploding. There's a safety car. Verstappen and Leclerc both fit new mediums and race off to the end. Realistically, looking at this, Leclerc has easily managed the gap to Verstappen, and there really wasn't much of a threat for the lead. Now, here's the interesting thing about Red Bull and Ferrari this weekend, and maybe this explains some of what we saw in the first stint. Now, I'm about to show you a lap comparison between Leclerc and Verstappen in qualifying. What you can see here on the top is the car speed, the throttle trace, and the time difference in seconds. This is Verstappen in blue and Leclerc in red. As usual, the Ferrari is a little bit stronger on the brakes, which will certainly be an advantage for overtaking. It also appears that the normal straight line advantage that we see with the Red Bulls is not particularly present this weekend. Additionally, the Red Bulls were a lot slower through turns 6, 7, and 9. So this leaves a few speculations or questions, really. Did Red Bull have to run more downforce this weekend as their performance through these high-speed corners was costing them too much lap time? Even with the downforce level they did run, they are a fair bit slower through the high-speed corners in qualifying trim. The next question is, did Ferrari find a bit of engine performance which allowed them to run more than their normal level of downforce while removing their straight line speed disadvantage? Lastly, did the lack of performance in the high speed hurt the Red Bull's overall performance and tire management? Now, excessive sliding through high speed corners can cause a substantial increase in tire wear and temperature, so this may be a factor. Now, before we move on to the Mercedes and Haas performance, let's try to understand why the tables seem to turn on Red Bull this weekend. My initial impression was that the Red Bull just overcooked the mediums on this first stint here, defending to Leclerc. And this is what cost them, as they were effectively forced into doing more stops than they wanted to. But looking at it a little bit more, I'm not sure this was the entire explanation. Hitting a cliff in tire performance after only 12 laps is a pretty big deal, considering your competitors could double that. With their advantage after the first stint, Ferrari could easily manage the race for what should have been an easy 1-2 finish. Now, the stint 2 on the hard tire comparison between the Ferrari and Red Bull wasn't as extreme as the first stint on mediums, but it really looks like Ferrari were able to manage the gap in the race without experiencing any deg at all like we saw with Verstappen. Now, in the final stint, Ferrari and Red Bull could more or less match the lap times of each other. Both of them hitting the tires pretty hard on the restart here, but Leclerc able to basically just hold the gap and take the win. Now, this is the first time we've seen Leclerc actually able to put pressure on Verstappen since, I believe, Australia, and the Ferrari came out on top for the second weekend in a row. Now let's switch gears and discuss Mercedes and Austria. Coming off the back of outstanding pace in Montreal and Silverstone, I'm sure a lot of people were hoping for a bit more from the Mercedes this weekend. In these last two races, in terms of outright pace, they were in the mix with the front runners. But this weekend in Austria, they took a step backwards. It's not really clear if the track didn't suit their car or if they were forcing themselves into a very tricky window with the very narrow operating window of the Mercedes W13. It is quite rare to see George or Lewis making large mistakes, and in qualifying. This happened to both of them, resulting in substantial damage and ending their sessions. Lewis even changed his chassis as a precaution before going into the sprint race on Saturday. As for the race, here's our race trace highlighting the Mercedes duo. After his collision with Perez resulting in a penalty, Russell spent most most of the race in traffic, so we really didn't get a clear view of the true potential of his car. He did manage to come through the field nicely to finish in P4. On the other hand, Lewis spent most of his race in clear air, so we can use his pace to assess where we think the Mercedes was actually at this weekend. Now, in terms of actual pace, let's check out our fuel-corrected comparison for Hamilton versus Leclerc. Now, here's Lewis in traffic at the beginning of the first stint, not particularly representative. Then you see him matching Leclerc's lap times in clean air at the end of the stint. Arguably, Lewis is probably taking a bit out of his tires at this point following in traffic and trying to overtake the cars ahead, so maybe he does actually have a bit of pace in hand. Now, on his second stint on the hards, he doesn't seem to have the outright pace at all at the beginning of the stint compared to Leclerc. Despite hitting the tires much harder initially, Leclerc suffers a little bit more degradation than Lewis, but not massively. A good way to look at the difference in the pace and degradation here is this. Based on the early stint, Leclerc can probably put 4 to 5 seconds into Lewis at the beginning of stint and then match his lap times through the rest of the stint. Now, I don't think this is the same Mercedes that we saw in the last 2 races. Finally, here we've got the safety car, and Lewis ends up staying out on his medium tires with effectively 5 laps on them. Now, my first reaction to this was, why didn't Lewis stop for a new set of mediums? He didn't have a new set of mediums. Realistically, their only option was to stay out on mediums. I think we've seen in the past that safety car restarts on the hard could be pretty problematic. Just ask Leclerc about Silverstone. Now, across the race, it's pretty clear that the Mercedes had a pretty reasonable gap to the front runners in terms of pace, which actually surprised me quite a bit this weekend. In both Silverstone and Canada, the Mercedes seemed to be a rocket ship, and here, just a fair chunk off the front runners in no man's land. Now, after last weekend in Silverstone, we're starting to see a different Mick Schumacher entirely. This weekend, he appeared to be in demon mode, but realistically, is the Haas actually improving? A lot of people seem to think so, so here are my thoughts on it. Realistically, Haas is just wildly variable in terms of their actual pace, the same as McLaren and Aston, and to a lesser extent the AlphaTauri and the Alfa Romeo. Different tracks tend to suit different cars, and one of the main things that set these midfield cars apart is often their understanding of the tires or their ability just to get the tires working in the first place. Now, the front-running teams with more downforce often have no trouble getting the tires working at all. The slower teams can struggle with this quite a bit, and the lack of downforce is often the main factor. Some weekends, the teams might be marginal on getting the tires working, and it makes the gap look huge. Then the other weekends, they could have the tires in the window, and they look like they're not too far off. Realistically, this weekend, the Haas just matched pace with the Alpine and McLarens, and they brought home a reasonable haul of points. Now, as much as I want to believe that Haas have unlocked some true performance in their car despite very few physical upgrades, I think that these classic racing circuits with a bit more high-speed content in them, they found their car in the window. Over the last 2 events, they've been the 5th fastest team and are currently 7th in the Constructors' Championship, but there's a long season left. Now, if you want to see what happened throughout the rest of the race field, I'll leave this race trace here with everyone on it for you. Feel free to pause the video or just check out my Twitter where I regularly post these after the races as just a little summary for everybody else before the video comes out. I hope you guys have enjoyed this video, and if you got any questions, be sure to leave me a comment while I come up with some video ideas as we go into the break before the French Grand Prix. I'll see you guys in France.